Welcome to the webinar, Top 5 Consumer Trends Shaping 2025 in the US Market. My name is Ilana Gorachinova, Senior Research Associate at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues, Cheryl Auger, Senior Research Director, and Amy Harris, Research Director here at Lux Research. Throughout your webinar, you can type in any questions you have in the question box on the screen. Time permitting, we will try to get to all of them, but in case we don't, please don't hesitate to email them to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. And now, let's dive into why today's conversation is so important. So over the past decade, we've seen consumer expectations shift dramatically. Back in 2016, brands were under pressure to lead with social responsibility, with movements such as Black Lives Matter, driving corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. But today, the landscape is changing. A backlash against DEI initiatives has left brands in a no-win situation. Taking a stand feels like a risk, but staying silent can also feel just as dangerous, especially with a deeply divided public where nearly equal numbers of voters supported opposing visions for the country. So in this shifting landscape, what we've done is identify 5 consumer trends, some of which are polarization, where consumers are increasingly letting their values shape their shopping choices, or slow living, where other consumers are stepping back from the fast-paced, high-stress culture of uncertainty and constant engagement. So what this webinar is designed to do is help you understand these emerging trends, and with that, help you navigate this unpredictable, topsy-turvy socioeconomic landscape. So with that, on the agenda today are 3 key items. We'll start with an overview of the methodology we use to identify the key trends that will define 2025, as well as an overview of the 5 key trends. Next, we'll break down what these trends mean for businesses and how brands can adapt to stay relevant in this evolving landscape. And finally, we'll wrap up with key takeaways to help you navigate these shifts with confidence. With that in mind, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Amy Harris, who will walk us through the methodology we use to identify the key consumer trends shaping 2025 in the US market. Take it away, Amy.
Thanks, Elena. As Elena said, I'm going to start by talking about our overall methodology, and then I'll talk about how we identified our top trends and introduce the trends themselves. So our approach is called predictive anthropology. At Lux, our virtual anthropologist analyzes millions of consumer conversations online to allow our researchers to carry out in-depth ethnographic research at scale. And we don't just track mentions of topics online like social listening does. Instead, we do a full contextual analysis of consumer conversations to uncover the implicit meanings and associations consumers make with any given topic. So analyzing how those conversations change over time, whether it's a subtle change or a more drastic one, is really what allows us to predict the future of consumer culture. And to identify our top trends for 2025, as a team, we looked back at our US consumer research over the past year. We identified the dominant patterns, or what was dominant last year, and then we dug deeper to find early signs of cultural shifts. So these were new things that were popping up repeatedly and things that our system predicted to grow significantly in the coming year. We also prioritized trends that are relevant across multiple CPG categories. That is to say, we were looking for higher level trends that we expect to impact consumers' behavior broadly. We focus on trends that will have implications for virtually all CPG brands. As you'll hear in our discussion, we're going to share some specific examples of industries that are likely to be impacted. But if you would like to discuss what they mean for your industry or your brand in particular, feel free to reach out to us at Lux, and we can also have a more tailored conversation. We also prioritize trends that are in different stages of development or maturity. And by maturity, we mean consumer consensus, or how well consumers agree on what a specific topic in culture means to them. When most consumers agree on what a culture means, we consider the culture to be mature or an established idea. And when there, in contrast, is a high level of disagreement among consumers on what something means, we consider that culture to be a new idea or less mature. And understanding maturity is really important for our clients because it helps them to identify when they should act on a trend. So early stage trends, or those that are less mature or represent new ideas, are typically ones that our clients want to monitor and plan for future action. On the other hand, more mature or mainstream trends are ones they may need to act on more immediately to avoid missing out. So we have prioritized trends at different levels of maturity, and we'll talk about the maturity of each trend today as we get into more of the details. And this way, you'll get a sense of which trends you might want to keep an eye on versus those you should consider acting on right away. Okay, so here are our top trends. We've got 5 that we identified this year. The first is polarization and division, and this refers to the growing ideological, political, and social gaps that are growing between groups in the US. The second is growing concerns around maintaining economic security in precarious times. The third is slow living, which entails consumers re-examining their pace of life. The fourth is aging with intention, which is about taking a more vibrant and active approach to aging. And the last is really about consumers who are grappling with what it means to be human in the age of AI. In today's session, in the interest of time, we are only going to dive into the first 3 of these trends. But if you would like to learn more about the remaining 2, we do have a full report published that is available for all of our clients to read in more detail. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl to discuss our first trend.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. As you mentioned, polarization and division is a key force that's shaping American society today. It's creating deep divides and reshaping public discourse, relationships, and even expectations for brands. Not surprisingly, this is a very complex issue, but looking at consumers' motivations and values can help us get a better understanding of why polarization is so intense and so impactful in our current moment. For some consumers, it's really about seeking control in an environment that they see as unstable and unpredictable. We've had COVID, inflation, wars around the world, creating uncertainty and instability for many. As such, there's a desire for control, and it can manifest as a strong alignment with specific political ideologies that promise certainty and order. Others are engaged in polarized political discourse to affirm their identity and to maintain a sense of belonging to a particular group. We see this very much so in social media, where echo chambers tend to reinforce group identities and can lead to a strong us versus them mentality. But no matter why it's happening, polarization directly impacts on consumer behavior and brand perception. Consumers are increasingly looking to brands to align with their values, and they're engaging in value-based shopping, something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in today's webinar. But for now, what I want to note is how polarization is fragmenting audiences. It's leading to greater demands for tailored messaging and purpose-driven strategies to build loyalty while avoiding alienation. So a couple of strategies that brands might think about in this context include personalization and customization. These can appeal to diverse groups of consumers while maintaining a broad appeal and avoiding that alienation I mentioned. Brands that empower consumers to create their own ideal product, whether it's a meal or a shopping experience, can increase loyalty without risking alienating a specific group. For example, M&M's allows consumers to print custom messages and images on packaging, making them inclusive without taking a strong stance or risking alienation. Another way that brands can address a polarized marketplace is to lead with optimism and positivity, with forward-looking messaging and solutions that avoid anything that's overtly reactionary. Highlighting stories of unity, celebration, progress, human connection can all help to situate a brand as a leader in this environment. I'll give you another example here. Coca-Cola has a history of advertising campaigns that focus on creating small moments of joy and human connection, from their Hilltop campaign in 1971 to their Taste the Feeling campaigns in the 2010s. These are all about helping people feel good while navigating uncertainty. Now, when we take a look at our maturity curve, polarization is mainstream. What this indicates to us is that most Americans agree polarization is happening. They agree on what it means. We also see that it's predicted to grow quite significantly. But ironically, polarization is still happening. We see people doubling down on their own ideologies. So this leads me to a related trend that's really important. And this is the idea of social and political wellness. So we have concerns about the impact of polarization that are reshaping how consumers think about wellness. In a polarized environment, this constant exposure to conflicting views is heightening stress and anxiety for many consumers. It's leading to that sense of uncertainty that I mentioned previously. And as a result, we see consumers turning to self-care, wellness as coping mechanisms. These practices offer people a sense of control over their personal health as well as their personal environment. They provide a counterbalance to this notion of external chaos that people feel in a polarized or divisive world. This is really important because many people feel powerless over societal events and outcomes. And by focusing on their personal health, they regain that sense of agency. So for example, many consumers are taking a more mindful approach to their news consumption. They're limiting how often, what they're reading, when they're reading it in order to manage their mental health. Now, while wellness and self-care are often personal practices or routines, we also see many consumers turning to community forms of wellness, things like group yoga classes, wellness retreats, even de-escalation courses. And these shared experiences help to foster a sense of community and support, creating what we might describe as social wellness, right? So for brands, what does this mean? Well, it means that there are opportunities to support consumers' broader wellness goals. And this goes beyond polarization to some of the bigger trends that we're seeing. It also relates to some of what we're seeing in terms of aging with intention that you can read about in our report. But what consumers are looking for are products, services, and campaigns that promote balance, mindfulness, and human connection in a fragmented world. And the brands that help consumers achieve this sense of agency and mental well-being will be seen as winners, will be seen as allies in this polarized environment. So not surprisingly, when we look at our maturity curve in the context of polarization, this idea of social wellness, political wellness is still in that early consensus. It is still evolving, but we predict that it will be growing over the next year and increasingly relevant to more and more consumers. It's also something that brands can offer solutions for, and as such, we wanted to highlight it. Now I'm going to turn things back to Amy to talk about economic security in precarious times, our next trend. Amy, you're on mute.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think it probably comes as no surprise to any of our attendees today that economic security is top of mind for consumers this year. Although the US economy is currently demonstrating resilience and growth, coupled with strong consumer spending and a healthy labor market, consumers are still deeply concerned about the impact of inflation, rising costs, and changes to economic policies that are impacting their financial well-being and quality of life. So concerns about affordability are not just limited to lower income consumers. Rather, this is a growing concern across the board Even we have seen white collar workers who are starting to feel destabilized with the rise of AI and concerns about loss of human jobs being replaced by technology. We also have the recent election of Trump and the potential for an extended trade war, which has consumers concerned about impacts not just on prices, but on the health of the economy overall. So all of these factors are combining to make consumers feel that they're living and they are really going through economically precarious times right now. And the important thing for brands to recognize here is that we're not just seeing superficial behavioral changes in response to high prices. Obviously, when times get tough, we tend to expect consumers to look for ways to save money, to cut costs, to pull back on spending. And while we are seeing some of that, we're also noticing some deeper cultural shifts as consumers are responding to an affordability crisis that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And so when we think of some of these deeper changes, we mean consumers are starting to rethink family structures, right, to find a more affordable way to live. For example, turning to multi-generational living to share bills and caregiving responsibilities with extended family. We also see people are delaying or foregoing having children altogether so they can achieve the type of lifestyle they want. Excuse me. The other thing we're seeing is consumers are beginning to rethink or redefine what success means to them. So traditionally, success in the United States meant owning a home. Now, home ownership feels so out of reach for so many people that consumers are wondering, do I really need to own a home to be successful or to feel financially secure? And perhaps renting is a better option, or consumers are looking to alternative forms of housing, including tiny home living. So we see a variety of ways consumers are adjusting their lifestyles and their expectations in order to cope in this environment. And of course, all of these changes will have impacts on their consumption habits. So if we take a look at the maturity curve here, we can see that this culture also sits in the mainstream, and it's expected to land in the established ideas in the next 1 to 2 years. Again, this is no surprise. Affordability concerns are hitting hard, and it's not just low-income consumers who are affected. So this trend is really relevant to a large number of consumers. I will pass it back to Cheryl now to discuss one of the sub-trends that we see emerging as a result of this larger trend.
Great, thank you so much. So we mentioned earlier in our presentation that we see a rise in value-based shopping. It is both in response to polarization as well as the concerns around economic security and precarity that Amy just discussed. And what we're seeing is that many consumers are striving for a more fulfilling experience when it comes to shopping, a more thoughtful approach to shopping, if you will. And we see many people are prioritizing quality over quantity, buying less but higher quality goods. We see consumers looking for transparency over ambiguity. We see consumers focused on long-term impact over short-term convenience in many instances. And a number of consumers, and a growing number of consumers, in fact, are focused on finding brands that resonate with their personal ethics and offer a sense of pride in making what they would deem to be responsible choices, right? What I want to note here and what's important is that this trend, this value-based shopping trend, transcends political boundaries. Whether consumers lean politically left or politically right, they increasingly see their shopping habits as a reflection of their principles. Okay, so shopping based on values allows consumers to express their political and personal identities. Consumers feel they are making a statement about who they are and what they stand for when they vote with their wallet, so to speak. Furthermore, the complexity of many of the issues that we've been discussing today can feel very overwhelming to consumers. Value-based shopping can simplify decision-making by filtering choices through that lens of personal values. For many, this can reduce the cognitive load, the decision-making cognitive load, and help that they are making decisions, help them feel, like they are making decisions that are not only good for them on a personal level, but are also good for the community or even the planet in some instances. And, this is something that brands need to navigate very, very cautiously, or they risk alienating consumers. Okay, so consistency in brand messaging across all platforms and touch points is crucial in this context, right? Consistency helps to reinforce a brand's values. It ensures that consumers do not feel misled or deceived, which is incredibly important for maintaining authenticity. Those brands that are not consistent, for example, brands that made social responsibility and DEI commitments in 2020, let's say, but have since retrenched or revoked some of those commitments, are being called out for performativity. We're already seeing this today. And furthermore, we're seeing consumers take a sophisticated approach to boycotting, boycotting certain products or boycotting at certain times of the month. And so we are seeing consumers respond to a lack of consistency from some of their favorite brands already in 2025. And based on our predictions, we expect this to continue. Another strategy related to consistency for brands is effective storytelling. We need to communicate a brand's history, mission, the people behind the products in order to enhance authenticity. Stories that resonate with consumers on an emotional level can deepen connections and provide more context for that brand's values and actions. However, if there's inconsistency between a stated value and a brand's actions, consumers will notice. And again, they will adjust their behavior accordingly. So where this sits on our maturity curve is still in that early consensus. We can talk about values like affordability, but as we think about responsible choices or ethical choices, this is still early on, but it's relevant to a large number of people. We expect this to grow by almost just under 28% in the next year or two. And this is something that brands are going to have to grapple with in the year ahead. And we strongly recommend taking a strategic approach that focuses on both the short-term and the long-term implications. From here, I'm going to pass things back to Amy to talk about our last trend for today's webinar.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Our last trend is slow living. And slow living is really a new development within the wellness space. In previous years, we've seen a focus on self-care, we've seen mindfulness, we've seen food as medicine, a variety of iterations on wellness. And now what we're seeing emerge is an increased focus on the pace of life. And this is a direct rejection of hustle culture and a reaction to what people increasingly see as the relentless pace of modern life. So slow living really is what it says it is. It's about slowing down. Consumers are rethinking their relationship with time, with technology, and with the people around them. It's important to note that for most people, slow living doesn't mean making drastic changes like moving off grid or growing all of their food from scratch. For most people, that level of slow living simply isn't practical. Most people do lead busy lives. They have work schedules, family obligations, and a lot of practical demands. So convenience is still essential in many cases. And this trend isn't about rejecting convenience entirely, but what we're seeing is really a shift towards being more intentional about when to prioritize convenience and when to take a slower, more deliberate approach. And as we'll see, convenience and slow living aren't always incompatible either. And this is really important for CPG brands to understand, particularly those that focus on convenient consumer solutions. Slow living is ultimately about intentional living, and consumers are spending their time and energy on the activities, relationships, and pursuits that really align with their personal values. And this is where understanding the human and cultural component is so critical. Our anthropological approach really helps to uncover those deeper consumer values that are guiding their decisions about how, when, and where to slow down. So if we take a look at the maturity curve, we can see that slow living is currently in the early consensus stage, and it's expected to grow to nearly 32% over the next 2 years, which brings it right to the cusp of the zone of innovation, or the ideal time for brands to start to innovate or take action. So this is definitely a trend that brands may want to start engaging with now, so that when mainstream consumers are ready in a few years, they're also ready for them. I'm now going to turn to a sub-trend of slow living to see how it's playing out on the ground. So Here we have embracing natural cycles. And in this culture, we see consumers are really looking towards nature's rhythm as the guide for their pace of life. They're observing the cyclical patterns of nature, the different seasons, periods of abundance, followed by periods of rest, and they're applying these principles across their own daily and yearly routines. And with this, we're seeing seasonal shifts in behavior. So for example, the fall and winter months, consumers are increasingly recognizing this is a time when the earth slows down, when nature goes to sleep. And as a result, we're seeing that they're starting to focus on rest and reflection in this time of year, also creating calm and cozy environments. So this, of course, impacts how consumers approach convenience. In these slower months, in the slower season, we may see consumers opting to order a takeout, for example, so they can stay in and have a cozy night on the couch or a fun night playing board games without having to cook. So here we see convenience and slowing down aren't always diametrically opposed. In spring, in contrast, this is seen as the season for growth and renewal, a time for adopting new habits, a time for setting new goals. And so we're also seeing evolving perspectives or shifts on traditional New Year's resolutions. So we do see some consumers moving away from the traditional January resolutions, with many now seeing the winter as the time to pause, right? The spring is seen as the more natural time for new beginnings. So this does also have implications for businesses. January is usually the time when you would expect consumers to sign up for new gym memberships or adopt healthier eating habits or buy all of the paraphernalia that they need for the new hobbies that they're going to adopt for the year. But messaging around these new resolutions or new habits may actually resonate more with consumers and also feel less stressful to them if they're done in the spring. And other areas where we're seeing consumers embrace natural cycles is with respect to food. We do see a growing interest in the United States with seasonal eating, as consumers are prioritizing produce that is in season. And if we want to think about the deeper values that consumers are connecting to this, we see it connects to their interest in sustainability. Many people see buying seasonal produce as more sustainable. Food that is locally grown and sourced tends to have a lower carbon footprint. We also see them valuing community engagement, and they see buying local and seasonal food as supporting their local economy. But this is also about enjoyment, and food. Consumers recognize that food that is picked in season or eaten in season is picked at its ripest, has the best, freshest flavors, and can give them a more enjoyable eating experience. So there's a variety of values at work here, and by embracing these natural cycles, consumers are really trying to find a more balanced and intentional way of living that feels both sustainable and restorative. And if we turn to look at the maturity curve for this culture, we see the culture is at the beginning of the early consensus stage, and it is projected to grow, but it's expected to stay within that early stage in the next 1 to 2 years. So this is a trend that we would recommend brands start to monitor to see how this develops over the coming years. And that, I believe, brings us to the conclusion of our 3 trends. And I will pass it back to Elena to discuss the key takeaways.
Thank you, Amy and Cheryl, for all of your insights. And now it's time to bring it all together. So we've talked about why this moment is so pivotal. Brands are navigating a landscape where taking a stand feels risky, staying silent isn't safe either. Amy and Cheryl have talked about how consumers are becoming more values-driven in how they shop, economic uncertainty is shifting priorities, and even convenience is being redefined. So what does it all add up to? Well, first, consumers are seeing brands as allies or adversaries, and it's really harder to find that neutral ground. In today's polarized landscape, brands aren't just selling products, they're also signaling values. Whether they embrace this or not, consumers are watching, and companies that contribute to their social and political well-being will win. Secondly, economic security isn't just about price. It's about values. As Cheryl was discussing, consumers are voting with their wallets, and it's not just about affordability. They're choosing brands that align with their beliefs, even if it costs more sometimes. So Businesses need to rethink how they communicate trust, ethics, and purpose in the context of affordability. And finally, as Amy was discussing, convenience is evolving and consumers want more than just speed. So the age of faster, easier, cheaper isn't over, but it is shifting. Some consumers are opting for slower, mindful choices over instant gratification in an era where their political, social, and economic lives feel overwhelming. And so brands that understand when and why people choose slow living over convenience will stay ahead. So ultimately, success in 2025 will require businesses to move with intention, approaching social responsibility with care, adapting to evolving economic priorities, and understanding that convenience is no longer one size fits all. And so with that, we'll be taking questions that you may have on the presentation, which you can type into the question box. And if we don't get to your question on this call, please email questions@luxresearchinc.com and somebody will get back to you. So the first question that we have here is, you mentioned value-based shopping as part of the economic security trend. How do consumers balance their commitment to their values with affordability?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And I think the answer is actually in the question. It is often a balancing act. It is contextual. It depends on what their value is. We also do see consumers recognizing that lower income people may not have the same option to make those same decisions. And we're seeing a fairly sophisticated response around who can do what and when. But at the end of the day, it is consumers who are balancing that decision, that desire for something that's affordable within their budget, in relation to whether or not they buy something that may be more premium but aligns with their values. And we see consumers are making complicated choices, and in some instances they're making trade-offs, potentially buying less but higher quality things if they can manage to do it, or looking for transparency in messaging to help them feel good about making a decision that may be a little bit of a budgetary stretch. But again, it is sometimes about trade-offs, sometimes about balancing, and it is dependent on consumers' individual circumstances and what they feel they can prioritize in that moment. But overall, we do see consumers trying to make decisions based on their values, even if they're constrained by budgetary issues.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I think we have very limited time, so I'll just quickly go over this final question. These trends focus on the US market. How do they compare to what we're seeing in international markets? Are similar shifts happening globally, or do different regions have their own distinct dynamics?
Yeah, again, I think the question was excellent because every region does have their own dynamics. As anthropologists, we always think that context matters. And if there's interest and we get feedback, we'll certainly do another webinar on more global trends in other markets. But what I would say is polarization is taking place outside of the US. We see it in Europe. I'm also Canadian. We see it in Canada. We're seeing very similar patterns as consumers deal with precarity, an uncertain environment, and feeling a little bit like things are outside of their control. What do you think, Amy?
Yeah, I would say slow living is also an interesting case. I think in some regions, slow living is not so much a trend as a way of life. It's deeply embedded. If we think of Southern Europe, for example, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, these regions have a long generations tradition of savoring meals slowly with family, seasonal eating, work-life balance, this sort of thing. So we wouldn't consider it a trend that's consciously popping in consumers' behaviors in those regions. But there are other regions. We think maybe Northern Europe, the UK, Western Europe, Germany, for example, cultures that have also kind of traditionally been faster paced, focus on efficiency and productivity. We do see kind of a rising interest in slowing down. And of course, the dynamics are different in every location, so it would be important and also interesting to take a look at how those things are evolving in different places.
Thank you, Cheryl and Amy, for your insightful answers. I'm afraid we'll have to stop here with the questions. But again, we'll try to get back to you if you email us. And this concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. And after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. So please take a moment and also check out our other upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.